The discovery of the city of Ugarit, like the discovery of many Near Eastern sites, was accidental. And here I want to bring up the whole subject of accidents and our topic, ancient Near Eastern archaeology and mythology. It seems that the hand of destiny is guiding many of the people who find these artifacts, because when you hear the stories about how they were discovered, they just as well could not have been discovered. How was the city of Ugarit discovered? In 1928, a peasant in Syria was plowing his field, a well-watered field not far from the Mediterranean Sea. He could see the Mediterranean from his field, and he ran his plow into a big stone. And he assumed the stone was a stone that hadn't been taken out of the field, which really angered him because he had contracted to clear the field for plowing. And when he uncovered the stone, he noticed its unusual shape. Luckily, and I say luckily from a scientific standpoint, there were scientific archaeologists from a French mission in the area. They went to look at this stone, which they uncovered, and it was part of a tomb. And what struck the people who saw this in 1928 was that the tomb bore a remarkable resemblance to the tombs of the Mycenaeans in Greece. What this was doing on the other side of the Mediterranean really mystified them, and it generated the wish among the French, both the French government and these French archaeologists, to excavate this site as soon as possible. And this was done very expeditiously. Sometimes the history of archaeology is very plodding and slow, but in this case it was very fast. In 1929, an expedition began to clear this land and excavate it, and they quickly discovered many tablets written in the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia. They deciphered, translated, and published these scripts within another year, that is, by 1930. And the world of ancient Near Eastern studies was taken by storm, as was the world of biblical studies, because this material, much of which was literary, mythic, tales of the gods, legends of great heroes, laws that related to religious ritual, much of this material cast light on the material in the Hebrew Bible. So accident played a role here, and accident has played a role in some of the other materials that we'll discuss in this series, among them the Amarna Letters, A-M-A-R-N-A, the letters from Egypt between the court of King Akhenaten and the vassal kings of Asia. These letters were found by a woman, again, a peasant in Egypt, who was searching through a field, and she saw these little pieces of clay, and they had some kind of markings on them, but they weren't hieroglyphs. Now, local people in Egypt, this is in the end of the 19th century, knew that if they found something with hieroglyphs on it, it was valuable. But these were other kinds of markings. They just looked like lines in various positions on the tablets. So the woman thought that they were of no value. Probably somebody had decorated some pieces of clay, and she began to grind them up to use as fertilizer, because it was well known that certain types of clay were good fertilizer. Now, how many she ground up, we don't know. But luckily, someone else in the area heard about these markings, looked at them, and realized they were cuneiform. But they were out of place. As we've been saying, cuneiform is the language of Mesopotamia. What were they doing in Egypt? Something was wrong. But in order to discover what was wrong, people had to decipher them, and they turned out to be one of the great finds of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So accidents play a role. Of course, accidents played a role in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, arguably the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. So these texts, as I said, were quickly deciphered and published. They revealed this rich civilization, and a civilization with affinities with biblical and Canaanite civilization. They showed that Ugarit's physical situation, its position on the Mediterranean coast, enabled it to be a cultural and trading center between the islands of the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the hinterland of West Asia, that is, the Hittite countries and Mesopotamia. So this became a kind of hub city for the ancient world. Among the many literary and mythological texts, archaeologists deciphered what they called the epics of the gods, descriptions of the various gods and their adventures. And we will discuss these in greater detail in later lectures. Ugarit was among the cities destroyed in the invasions of the Sea Peoples around 1200 BC. And among their gods were El, Baal, and Anat, three gods that are familiar to many readers of the Bible who will know their names from the biblical narratives. So Ugarit, a great find, rich in mythological materials, unlike Ebla, cast considerable light on the interconnections between the civilizations. In our last lecture, we talked about comparisons, Egypt as opposed to Mesopotamia. Here I want to advance the idea of interconnections. What we find from the documents is that these societies were in touch with each other. As one wit has put it, the mail was much better in the second millennium BC in the Middle East than it is today. And I actually think it's true. And actually, in some places in the Near East, it was better than it now is in the United States. That is, they had messengers between cities, between countries, and very importantly for our understanding of how myths develop, they had translators. I mentioned these dictionary documents from Ebla, and I'm asserting that they're among the first dictionaries. We know that there were active translators in all of these societies, so that myths, stories, records get translated and transmitted from one society to another, and in this way, societies influence each other. So let us move from these two Syrian cities, Ebla and Ugarit, to the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia, that is what today would be Central and Eastern Turkey. There, a great empire began to develop in the second millennium BC, and it was centered on the city of Hattusas, which was established in approximately 1800 BC. This culture used a cuneiform system of writing, but they did not use the languages of their Mesopotamian neighbors. Rather, they used a language that we now think of as Indo-European. They became very powerful and threatened, and at one point conquered the great empire of Babylon. They too, the Hittites, were eventually conquered by the Sea Peoples of approximately 1200 to 1100 BC. Now, always returning to our idea of myth, we need to ask, do the Hittites offer us mythic materials? Have we found them? Do we find more than administrative lists? And the answer is assertively yes. There's a great richness of mythic material. What is distinctive about it is that these myths are tied by the Hittites themselves to rituals. You will recall that I mentioned the myth and ritual approach to the study of myth, where theorists make the connection between people's stories and people's rituals. What is remarkable is that the Hittites themselves made these connections. They would write down stories, and they would give instructions about when and how these stories are to be repeated. Now, the Hittites also have a place to play in modern history, as strange as this may sound, because in the formation of the identity and nationalism in modern Turkey, in the secular state of Turkey, there's a hearkening back to the Hittites. And if one goes to Istanbul and travels through Turkey, you can see the display of Hittite architecture, Hittite artifacts, and in the Great Museum in Istanbul, the Archaeological Museum, a rich display of Hittite materials. And this is in keeping, this observation about the Hittites is in keeping with a point that I will be making throughout, that the modern Middle East, in its political forms, in its modern nationalisms, continually is looking back at the ancient East. In order to understand themselves, modern Middle Eastern peoples are referring back to ancient peoples.